Hi, I am back with this part two video. So the other interesting aspect of nonverbal communication that I wanted to highlight is this idea that clothing, our actual appearance, like our body types and what we wear over them, that is considered a form of nonverbal communication. And I think that we all know that, people will say, you only have a few seconds to make a first impression, and oftentimes that impression is made partly by the clothes that you are wearing. That might not be fair, but it's reality. It's how it works. I mean, and I think again, if we look at so much of what we do in decoding communication as like trying to make meaning out of the world and to figure things out, then it kind of makes sense that we would look at how somebody actually physically looks and what they're wearing to make certain kind of inferences about them. Now, one of the things from last week that I wanted to point out is the difference between, because I probably overemphasized the role of stereotype a little bit more in prototype than I meant to. Upon reflection, I think the better way to think about a prototype is not a stereotype. So a stereotype would be a fixed belief, whereas a prototype is sort of like an organizing way of thinking about something that might be based with some stereotypical thinking in it, but it's not as fixed. And I think that when we look at people and judge their clothing, I think what we're doing is more of a prototype than a stereotype. So a stereotype is something that's much more fixed and ingrained in our thinking and often very unconscious, whereas a prototype might have some of that stereotyping in it, but we're willing to change our attitude, right? So you might meet somebody, like if you saw this guy and he came in like for an interview, you would think, oh my gosh, what a loser. Like, who comes in to an interview dressed like that, right? But then if you might find out like through the conversation that maybe something happened and he got locked out of his apartment or something. But in other words, it's possible that you could then change your mind and give this person a second chance. So I think we see a lot of prototyping in how we judge people and their clothing. And so I think it's an important thing to be aware of, that it is a form of nonverbal communication, right? Whether we like it or not. And it is important to pay attention to that aspect of our nonverbal communication as well. And so related to this idea of our clothing, I think it's also really interesting to look at something like tattoos. And I really like this quote here. Many individuals are so closely identified with their personal artifacts that it is virtually impossible to divorce them. Many people have personalized artifacts and accessories that define who they are. And I think we see this no more like clearly than in the choice that somebody makes to have a tattoo. Such a powerful form of nonverbal communication. So one place where we really see stereotyping giving way to prototyping, right? If we're talking about a fixed idea versus a changeable kind of notion, would be about tattoos in the workplace. Because a lot of employers, I think 10, 15 years ago, would really not hire somebody who had a tattoo. Or if you went into, I had a student who had quite a few, she had a lot of tattoos down her arms, and I, just didn't even notice them anymore. And she came to me and she was worried about going for a job interview. And I said, well, cover them up for your initial interview. And I said, but then if you go further, at some point, you're going to have an open conversation about it. And of course, even with her arms fully covered, they could still see that she had tattoos. And so you really do think, wow, like, what a bad reason, like, not to hire somebody. But again, we go back to these ideas that, this is nonverbal communication, right? And it's part of appearance, and people will judge us, for that. But now, look at this. 42% of managers said they would lower their opinions of someone based on his or her tattoos and piercings. Piercings are another really good example of a nonverbal communication about your personality. So people would say, even some of the statistics being that 76% of respondents in a career builder survey felt that tattoos were very unprofessional. And I really do see this as an attitude that's changing. And I think one of the places it is changing is the business world is slowly opening up. More creative jobs are the ones where you're going to have people where it's much more acceptable to have tattoos. When I worked in publishing in the late 90s, if you went on one side of the building, that's where I was in PR and marketing, all the PR, marketing, and salespeople, we all were, pretty professionally dressed. And we also, we did business casual. But when you went into the design department where they did the book covers and everything and the illustrations, they wore like crazy clothes and they had tattoos and crazy hairdos. And it was great. They were not crazy hairdos. I mean, like they had, maybe they had like a mohawk, what would normally be considered, not allowed in the professional workplace. And I think that's happened. This has been happening more and more. And I think that millennials and Generation Z have a very different relationship with having, body piercings and tattoos. So I will put this slide share up. So if you want to, it goes into a little bit of the history of tattooing and everything. But I just wanted to sort of hit on this last slide to finish up. But, some reasons for getting a tattoo. Let's look at these, right? A memorial of friends or a tribute to somebody or, something that you love. Managing your emotions, like you might have been through a trauma and having a tattoo. I know a young man who has a tattoo on his back and it says the past. The past is here and it's behind him, and that was really meaningful for him. It could be just, a personal fashion statement, but it can be very deeply spiritual. So when we look at communication, right, when we look back to our first discussion about definitions, and most of us sort of appreciated and kind of rallied around this idea of we use this to create meaning. And I think that this is someplace that you really see that, where people really want to express something about themselves. And it is such a powerful form of nonverbal communication for that reason. So anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and I hope you guys have a great week.